airliners are hijacked, turned into devastating bombs. Thousands of people are feared dead.
I hope I live. It's coming down on me.
At 8:45, hijackers crashed an airliner into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York. Then 20 minutes later, a second plane plowed into the South Tower. Smoke and flames shot above, debris and the dome fell below. Then around 9:40, another explosion, this time in Washington. Another hijacked plane hit the Pentagon. Then just after 10 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed and vanished in a cloud of dust, soon followed by the other building.
Smoke poured out of the skyscraper, and the scene was a mess. Then, less than 30 minutes later, it happened again. A second plane was hijacked, and as people around the world watched on television, it flew straight into the other tower, punching a huge hole through the building.
And I heard a roar, and I looked around thinking that it had to be a helicopter, and I looked up and I saw the second plane hit. It had to be a commercial-sized airliner.
What went through your mind?
That it couldn't be real. Just that it couldn't be real.
Unbelievably, a half hour later, that scene too repeated itself. Floor after floor of falling debris. Billowing smoke and soot seemed to cover the lower portion of Manhattan Island. There was panic everywhere. And late this afternoon, word that another building at the World Trade Center complex collapsed. New York officials were stunned and somber.
And we will strive now.
This is the worst terrorist atrocity the world has witnessed, and its devastating consequences on the most powerful nation have reverberated around the globe. As the superpower closed its doors, the rest of the world assessed their security and vulnerability. At home, the Prime Minister urged the world to unite to eradicate mass terrorism, and he was resolute in his solidarity with the United States.
We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy.
Russian President Vladimir Putin said his country had experienced terrorism, and his people understood the feelings of the American people. We are with you, he said, and we share and feel your pain in full. For some, though, in the Middle East, the American suffering has been a time for jubilation. In Lebanon's largest refugee camp, the home of 75,000 Palestinians, shots were fired in celebration. And in the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, more triumphant scenes. But Middle East leaders have shared in the worldwide outrage.
We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil.
President Bush providing some comfort during one of the darkest days in the history of the United States.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat, but they have failed.
And in and around Washington, D.C., the Pentagon, the White House, the Capitol, all evacuated. The president airborne, location undisclosed, fighter jets escorting Air Force One. Across America, all air travel suspended for the first time in the nation's history. State and federal offices closed, and perhaps most ominously, the United States military went to its highest alert status. For them, we are at war. In the days and weeks that follow, America will take toll of this day. The wounded, treated, the dead, buried, then mourned. And even before the mourning is complete, the nation will turn to preventing this from happening again. But how? And what will those precautions be? Given today's events, no idea, no suggestion seems outrageous. Will armed fighter jets patrol the skies? Will anti-aircraft defenses be put into place in and around major cities? Will New York look like London during World War II? There is no event to which we can turn in order to put today into context. The attacks have no counterpart in world history. As a nation, we can recover, but we will never return to a time before 9/11, 2001. Whatever the United States response will be, certainly we are in uncharted waters, and our very livelihoods are at stake. In New York, Shepard Smith, Fox News.
Fox News' continuing coverage of the tragedies in New York City and Washington will continue throughout the day.
This is the single biggest recorded act of terrorism in our memory.
But so far, the death toll, fears of the death toll could go as high as 10,000 people.
I just hung up with Donald Trump to talk about the impact on real estate. He told me that obviously it's the worst thing he's ever seen, and that many of the companies that he does business with are gone.
The attack on America.
What the hell is that? Holy. Oh my God!
This is continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America.
I really consider what happened in New York and at the Pentagon to be a declaration of war against the United States. And I believe that we must respond accordingly.
Esta es una edición especial de Ocurrió Así. La del terrorismo.
Percent of Americans would be willing to give up some civil liberties to have a safer world.
That's right. That's what happens after a horrific event like this. But that could fade over time if there were no subsequent problems.
So what would your counsel be to the president?
So sustaining, obviously completely revamped airport security, but not only that, because now that it's the airport and airplane hijacking that's been the cause of this, the next attack, if there is one, will be something rather different. And frankly, this gets to my second point, which is if you study the way terrorists behave, they try to do something like this, and then they try to follow up fairly quickly so that the populace doesn't have any sense of rebuilding its confidence and security. So I would think we have to be very heightened for a variety of other kinds of attacks, totally unrelated to airports and airlines, that could cause some horrific damage, which would again rock America back on its heels.
Well, the name Osama bin Laden continually comes up as the man who is either behind this or he's connected to it in some way. Do you agree with that? Is he the one we should be focusing in on?
Well, you know, obviously the federal government has to make that determination. There seems now to be a lot of circumstantial evidence and corroborative evidence to suggest that his group was involved. If that turns out to be the case, obviously we have to do whatever we can, and we should do it multilaterally as well as unilaterally, to try to seize him or destroy him in his operations. We also need, by the way, to have much better involvement, I think, even with the Arab governments in the Middle East who we are supporting, including the Saudis, and bin Laden is a Saudi national, including Egypt and including Jordan, where we have strong economic and political and military ties, and we have to enlist their cooperation to ensure that these kinds of cells are identified and rooted out in advance of this kind of horrific attack.
Undeniably, some frustration between the shock that turns to grief, that will turn to anger, as we become fully aware of the magnitude of these losses and in fact begin to see the visual images of thousands of caskets and funerals. That fury is going to demand a response. The administration is preparing a response, and that response is probably going to exceed the kinds of responses that we've seen in the past. This is not going to be a single salvo of cruise missiles, but rather the beginning of an ongoing campaign.
So what went wrong? Speculation is each jet struck the towers with such impact, the special fire-resistant insulation was ripped off the trusses and beams, exposing the bare steel to temperatures of 2,000 degrees. Minute after minute, the steel was softened by this boiling cauldron fed by oceans of jet fuel. The combined weight of glass, desks, computers, chairs, and people finally overcame the weakened steel, and gravity finished off the towers. The final impact was so horrific it was recorded on seismographs. The first few floors were driven 40 feet into the ground. The remains of the World Trade Center towers resemble more of a burial mound than a broken building. But it wasn't over. Hours later, a smaller, sister building number 7 couldn't take it anymore, and it too collapsed in a heap. Building number 5 is not likely to survive either. But both of the smaller buildings lack one important thing: victims.
There was another one. We just saw another one. We just saw another one apparently go. Another plane just flew into the second tower. This has to be deliberate, folks.
We saw a shadow, it looked like a plane. Next thing we know, it was boom, and the floor started shaking.
We just felt a big explosion. Yeah, David, we are looking at the replay of what happened that you're describing. It happened just moments ago. It sure appears that the building simply collapsed.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America.
Everything came down. Couldn't see, couldn't breathe. It's terrible. I never seen nothing like it.
I saw the building just coming down.
We have watched the tragedy of an outrageous act of barbaric terrorism.
Just saw a burst, a big burst. And then I saw people jumping out of the buildings.
This is indeed the most tragic hour in America's history. And yet I think it can be its finest hour.
Everybody took cover to run. We ran down the subway, but the dust followed us down there.
I used to work on the 105th floor of the World Trade Center. Are we going to go down there? And I'm in shock. I know a lot of people are still up there. I mean, I don't know where they are. Of course.
Our thoughts and prayers are with those families and those injured and those who are the casualties of today's attack. We also remember those thousands of people who are rescue workers. We ask now that we all bow our heads in a moment of silence and remembrance.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong.
People leaving Manhattan this afternoon, maybe you've seen these scenes before, in lower Manhattan, the Brooklyn Bridge, famous to so many people. Just look at that. And look how orderly everyone is. Concern, anxiety, certainly, but order. No panic here. Amazing in view of what had just happened a few minutes before, after the planes struck the building. It comes down. Only 31 years old, the World Trade Center towers, and down they came. Down they came after the fire in the towers reached 1,500 or 1,600 degrees or even more. That melted the steel. As it melted the steel, shell or frame, the floors collapsed, each on the other, and down they came into rubble. And amid this, the chaos, understandable chaos, confusion, fear, fleeing, the pure, basic human instinct of self-preservation. And yet, even in these scenes, again and again, the reports of how many individuals helped each other, helped pull them along, their friends, their colleagues. And tonight, the rescue efforts continue. Heavy machinery as well as floodlights, runoff portable generators have been brought in. There are up to 10,000 rescue workers in Manhattan, working day and night. Still no estimates as to what the casualties will be in the World Trade Center bombings, but the work continues. It has only begun. Which also raises another question, a question that New Yorkers will be asking as they get up this morning, and perhaps people across the nation will be asking too. Was this it? Is it now over? As horrendous as it was the taking down of the two towers here, the bombing of the Pentagon, the bombing of the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. Is that the end of this terrorist attack by whomever organized it? Or could there be more attacks? We don't know. We don't want to raise any undue concern. But as a reminder that, yes, it could happen again. It is, as somebody also observed looking at these documents, these memos, these expense accounts, the letters that floated down from the World Trade Center towers. Whatever the high-tech age has brought us, we are not yet a paperless society.
Garrick.
So much invested in those papers and those lives and in those jobs. Yes, Ralitza.
Garrick, thank you very much.